Iloa, oh boy, getting up. Oh my goodness, that's an awful sight to see. They will take him to the sideline immediately.
Hey everybody, Coach Connor here with another episode of the 10-Minute Strength Pod, and this week we're going to be talking about concussions. So with September being Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, I thought it would be pertinent to talk about youth mental health when it comes to athletes. And we're still going to talk about that a little bit, but we're going to kind of shift to talk about concussions and the roles that they can play within that instead. So to start this off, in 2021, the government here in the U.S. did a survey with high school age students looking at their mental health. And what they found was that 40% of high school kids were persistently sad, right? And hopeless, right? So the word hopeless, I don't know if you've ever looked up the definition of the word hopeless, but I've got it right here. It's having no expectation of good or success. So 40% of high school age kids had absolutely no expectation of anything good or any kind of success happening within their lives during 2020 into 2021. That's an absolute tragedy, but it gets worse. 20% of those surveyed, so not 20% of that 40%, 20% of those surveyed said that they had been suicidal within the last year and a half. So 20% of high school age kids thought that their life was so bad that there was no hope, absolutely void of any hope, to the point where they thought the best course of action was going to be to kill themselves. And this is an absolute tragedy, and this is something that we need to really talk about. And, you know, while those numbers probably weren't due to concussions and things like that, concussions can play a role in that. I would say that those numbers were more than likely the result of the insanity that was the pandemic, not allowing kids to go to school, not allowing organized sports. Kids couldn't practice, they couldn't exercise, they couldn't socialize and be around their friends. I think that had a lot more to do with it. But again, we're going to talk about how concussions can kind of push this a little bit further. So back to concussions. In the opener, you saw the aftermath of Tua getting absolutely crushed on the field of play. He was stumbling to get back to the huddle there. The team that day decided to tell the world that it had been a back issue, and clearly it wasn't. If you're watching that, you can see, and we're going to watch another clip of him taking a hit from just last night. But if you watch that clip, you can see clearly that's not like pain that's preventing him from being able to do that. It's the fact that he has no idea where he is. So we're going to pull up this hit from last night, and we're going to talk about like why this is kind of insane. But here it is. If you're not watching, if you're listening, I'll kind of describe what happens. But here's the hit from last night. It's insane how much time he had to throw that ball. So he gets wrapped up and slammed to the ground. He's on his side, immediately rolls to his back. This is actually called a Decorticate Posture, and this is the sign of a traumatic brain injury. There's Decorticate and Deceribit. There's actually two different types of posturing that happen after traumatic brain injury, and for the life of me, I cannot remember. One represents something that happened above the brainstem. One represents something that happened below it. If I remember correctly, Dr. Del Rossi, if you're watching, you can correct me. But you see that he went straight into that position. That hit wasn't all that extreme. I mean, sure, his head hit the ground pretty hard, but if you watch that hit, it probably, like, the outcome of that probably had a lot more to do with the fact that he had a concussion just 5 days earlier playing on Sunday. So it's hard to watch. We'll watch it one more time so that you can get a better look at it. All right, so he's in the backfield. Guy misses his assignment, comes, wraps him up, throws him, and boom. You see his head hit the ground pretty hard. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not a hard hit, but what I will say is probably 9 times out of 10, you don't end up in that position, in that kind of Decorticate posturing, if he doesn't also have a concussion just 5 days prior. So what people are talking about now is something called second impact syndrome. And second impact syndrome in high school athletes has actually killed them before. It's having a concussion and then getting another concussion before you're fully healed. So you could imagine, like, if your leg, you broke your leg and it wasn't done healing yet, it wouldn't take nearly as much force to kind of create more damage and re-break that leg, right? The same thing happens in the brain. So that second impact syndrome more than likely played a role in the fact that not quite so severe of a hit put him into that kind of position. And so in watching that video, you can see somebody dropped the ball somewhere, right? Whether it was the athletic trainer, it was the head coach, whether it was the team doc, somebody dropped the ball. Tua should have never been in that game. Somebody's going to get fired, somebody's going to get fined, somebody's going to get sued, something's going to happen. But I will say, in my experience with college sports, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in the pros, but in college sports, usually that's a head coach putting pressure on somebody, strong-arming them into forcing them to let somebody play. I saw it happen, especially working combine prep. You would hear stories from these guys at different universities that they'd play at, just the horror stories of what they were forced to play through, or not even just concussions, but herniated discs, torn labrums, torn meniscuses, things like that. It's very common. So I'm not gonna say I know for sure, but I am going to venture and guess that that was either a head coach or possibly an owner thing. You're paying that young man a lot of money. They want him in the game, and so he ended up being in the game. And it's crazy that right now, right after everything that the NFL has done with, they had $1 billion settlement for concussions and athletes now dealing with dementia because of those concussions playing the sport. And this was from back before guys were really paid enough to put themselves into those positions. That this is still happening. That happened on national TV, and the guy played 5 days later. It's absolutely insane to me. The NFL had that $1 billion settlement. And it's what's crazy to me, this is kind of like the dirty little secret about all of this, is the vast majority of the guys who are getting settlement money from that, their issues didn't happen when they were in the NFL. They're happening in Pop Warner. They're happening in middle school football, high school football, college football. By the time they get to the NFL, a lot of these guys, a lot of them have had a ton of traumatic brain injuries, and the NFL is just kind of getting the brunt of all of it because they're the ones with the most money. I think somewhere down the line there's going to be some class action lawsuits, like bigger ones against the NCAA, and God help us if they ever happen at the local level with high schools and counties and cities and states and things like that, because it will absolutely bankrupt sports, and sports will more than likely be gone. But the dirty little secret is that most of these injuries are happening well before these guys get to the NFL. All right, so speaking of these things happening at the lower levels of play, we're going to start talking about kind of youth dealing with these traumatic brain injuries and what can happen as a result of all of it. So back in 2010 to 2013, so the study I think was published in 2014, the Pacific Institute of Research and Evaluation, they assessed the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System data from 100 emergency rooms throughout the country. And again, this data was collected between 2010 and 2013. What they found was that in kids 10 to 14, 54% of all concussions came from contact sports. And within these contact sports, they're also including soccer, because it is a contact sport. If you've ever played it or watched it, I'm sure you'd be able to see that. From ages 15 to 19, about 40% of these concussions came from contact sports. And just understanding everything else, right? So we're talking car accidents, falling and bumping your head into furniture. Those are where the other concussions tend to come from. What it also found was that football was the 5th leading cause for TBI in kids ages 5 to 9 years old. And it also found that 20% of high school athletes playing contact sports sustain at least a concussion each year. It's a lot of kids. So to kind of piggyback off that, the Journal of Athletic Training, this was in 2018, if I remember correctly, found that there's roughly 300,000 TBIs in youth sports each year. That study just kind of went to look at it. They didn't talk about how to prevent them or anything like that, but they're saying there's about 300,000 every single year, and that would make sense because 20% of high school kids are going to get a concussion while playing contact sports throughout the year. Those numbers kind of add up and make sense. There's also a 2017 article published in Brain Science, right? And this is important to understand. 90% of all TBI cases in youth are considered mild, and 85% of all concussions and TBI issues in kids or cases in kids have full recovery. That means 15% of these concussions are not going to have a full recovery. And we're going to talk about like what that means, not being fully recovered, and the things that you're going to deal with throughout the rest of your life right now. So long-term effects of TBIs, there's a lot of them. Most of this is kind of, I guess, theorized more than anything else. They're more correlated, I guess that's the best way to say it. But they found that it can lead to Alzheimer's, dementia, just run-of-the-mill dementia, increased risk of suicide, depression, addiction, slow speed of processing when it comes to cues throughout the world, becoming easily distracted and having very high difficulty focusing. Hormonal changes, right? And that's because the pituitary actually helps create some of the really important hormones in your body, or at least it signals your body to do that. It can significantly increase the odds that you're going to have low levels of testosterone earlier in life, and it can also affect your growth hormone. So there's a lot of things that these concussions can do to you over time, and we're talking about the 15% of people who don't fully recover from these traumatic brain injuries. And as somebody who had a lot of concussions growing up, I got my first one when I was 4 years old. I jumped off my top bunk bed, ended up in the hospital. I had another one a year later because I fell off the monkey bars and landed on my head. And then throughout hockey, had quite a few. I had one my first year at junior, and it took me out for 6.5, almost 7 weeks. And that was kind of the last real big one I had. But I had so many prior to that it took almost nothing for that to happen. The way I got that concussion that took me out for so long is I was on the ice and a drill had stopped. Coach blew the whistle, and me and a guy, one of my teammates, were kind of coasting towards each other. And I went to turn, and I hit a rut in the ice and fell face first down. I don't remember much after that. I do remember being in line. It was a passing drill with some shooting and stuff, but you started the drill with a pass, and I was missing my teammates by 5+ feet behind them. My coach is just absolutely losing his mind on me, and our assistant captain kind of went over to him. He was like, "Hey, Chad, I don't know that you saw it, but I think he's concussed." So he came over, looked at me. My pupils were dilated. I went into the locker room. The locker room that we had at the time was a bright yellow color. I instantly started throwing up. For some reason, I was allowed to drive home. I think just nobody really kind of kept an eye on me. I was allowed to drive home. It was a day, it had been overcast for a really long time. We had had a bunch of snow, and the sun was out for the first time. And I can remember pulling over on the side of the highway, having to throw up because the light was so intense coming off the snow. It made me nauseous. I went home and I slept for, I don't know, I think I ended up sleeping for 15 or 16 hours. I slept straight through work the next day and was late to getting to practice, even though I wasn't allowed to be on the ice. So these, that was just my experience. Again, talking about how much easier it is to get concussions after they've happened the first time. And just the fact that I deal with some of the things that I do now, as many of you know, I'm a recovering addict. I'm a recovering alcoholic, a little over 2 years now. But I deal with a lot of these things. I have really hard time controlling impulses, right? I'm very trigger happy when it comes to doing things. I struggled with suicide. If you read any of my blog post about my recovery, what kind of prompted that was a suicide attempt where I ended up accidentally knocking myself out and coming to the next day. I struggle to process things. If you listen to this podcast and you watch these podcasts, there's a lot of times where I'm going, and you'll hear all that a lot because it's hard for my brain to keep up with what I'm wanting to talk about. So those uhs and ahs kind of create a little pause in the silence so that my brain can catch up to what I'm trying to talk about. Again, I've dealt, Alzheimer's and dementia, the jury's out on that. It's a little early now. I'm sure the fact that I drank as often and as much as I did probably isn't going to help when it comes to all those things either. But, I've dealt with addiction. I struggle with impulse control. I have to really talk myself off a ledge sometimes and take a step back before I make any real decisions. Hormonal changes. I wouldn't say I'm somebody that lacks, that has low T, but I've never really had that checked all that much. But it's something that can happen. So I'm here to tell you, these concussions that you get when the sport doesn't really matter all that much. This happened when I was playing junior hockey, not when I was earning $1 million a year to play the sport. This happened before my life even really started, and I'm still dealing with a lot of it now. And that goes back to the whole dirty little secret that most of these guys that are getting money from the NFL, these weren't injuries sustained at the NFL level. They were things that happened well before that. And I guess, in talking about this, I'm trying to implore you as a parent to kind of keep an eye on things. I don't think for a second that you shouldn't allow your kids to play sports. The benefits of sports well outweigh the potential injury and potential cost, right? But keep an eye on them, especially if they've been concussed. Do not let them go back out there. If you go back to that video of Tua, when he's in this position, if you ever see your child on the field of play looking like that, do not let their coach put them back in. I don't give a shit how important the game is. Your kid does not go back out there. It doesn't matter if it's a championship game. He's a starting quarterback. He's got 15 universities looking at him. That kid does not go back in the game. And a lot of schools, at least now we're starting to have athletic trainers who are not going to let those kids go back in the game. But as a parent, you've still got to kind of be like your child's advocate, because your kid's going to want to go back out there, and you've got to be the voice of reason, because a lot of times the coach is not going to be that person. And so for the life of me, I can't remember why I went down this path here. But, just it's the potential for long-term issues from concussions is there, and I just want to make you aware of that by kind of talking about all these things. All right, so now we've talked about like the negative outcomes as far as TBIs go for people who don't fully recover from them. Now comes the question, can we prevent concussions? And my answer is both kind of yes and kind of no. There's the reason why I say no is because it's not caused by a hit, right? We can cover these athletes, their heads in foam, and what's going to be like the deciding factor as to whether or not they get a concussion when they get hit is most likely going to be the velocity of the hit and the velocity of the speed that they were traveling at. Your brain floats inside your skull. It's not like expanded all the way out. It's actually kind of floating in there. And so when you're moving and you stop, brain keeps going, right? So there was a study in 2018 in the Journal of Exercise Rehabilitation that showed that we can possibly prevent some concussions by strengthening like the musculature of the neck. And they came to the conclusion, anticipating a head impact and allowing cervical neck musculature to brace for the impact reveals less head movement and acceleration following a head impact, which may lead to fewer concussions. Again, it may. And part of this is there's something called a coup counter coup, right? So a lot of times it's not the initial hit that you take. It's as the head comes back, the brain's going to... So if I'm going this way, right, and I get hit here and I come back, it's not just this stop. It's the fact that when I go back, like my brain is going to continue to move and it's going to hit my skull. And that's a lot of times where it comes from. So these helmets, I still contend. My dad said it when I was very young growing up, and it only started to make like a whole lot of sense as I got into school. If you really want to prevent concussions in the sport of football, and hockey would be a little bit tougher just because you're playing on the ice and not on something that's soft. But in the sport of football, if you want to prevent concussions, take the face masks off the helmets or take the helmets away altogether. The reason why we have so many head injuries in the sport of football, outside of the fact that these guys are monsters and they're enormous and they're traveling at crazy high rates of speed, is because they can hit with their head, right? So if we took that option off the table and we forced guys to have to kind of tackle with their shoulders and not lead with their face and not lead with their head, then you'd probably see a lot fewer concussions, especially from, the head-to-head contacts. Because who's going to go to tackle somebody leading with their head if they've got no protection on it? I know I'm probably not going to, and I know just as an instinct for most people, it would be the same way. So a lot of coaches want to say that we're preventing concussions by strengthening the musculature of the neck, and I think that is mostly kind of an exercise in futility and a waste of time. I think the best way to control or create the best possible outcomes when it comes to concussions is to get stronger and have better control over your body. So if you've got better control of your body as you go back, right, we're not going to have that kind of whiplash where your head just smacks back and hits the ground. If you can control yourself and stay tighter, you're going to have better outcomes as far as all that goes. So there's some data to suggest that we may be able to reduce the severity of some concussions by neck training. But you could also make the argument that training the neck as often as some guys do would lead you to be more fatigued, which could actually decrease the likelihood that you're able to control your head. So, who knows? If you're somebody who's a strength coach and you do a lot of neck care, like as far as manual neck and things like that, in an effort to try to prevent concussions, you're probably wasting your time that could be better spent doing something else that would have a more positive impact on concussion outcomes. So can we prevent concussions? Maybe. Maybe. So that's really all I have for you today. It was a little bit longer of an episode. Kind of wanted to talk about some stuff. Wanted to bring the whole thing with Tua to light to kind of, put a face to what parents think about when their kids are out there on the field and get hurt. Hopefully your teams have an athletic trainer on staff on site who can make those calls. Hopefully the coach isn't too preoccupied with everything else going on, that they can see what's going on with the young athlete and they can keep them out of the game. Hopefully they care enough to keep that young man or young lady out of the game. And as a parent, you need to be your child's advocate. If your kid ever goes down and you see them in a position like Tua was last night, or stumbling off the field like he did in the opener this past weekend, you need to, you can be the crazy parent who goes out on the field, right? You get your kid off that field, because the likelihood of them recovering from that second concussion, right, that's sustained after the first one, the likelihood's actually pretty high. That second one is incredibly low, and I'm telling you from personal experience, you don't want to let them go down that road. It's a terrible place to be. It takes a lot more effort just to live and do things, and it's not worth it. So, in conclusion, right? Don't let this happen to your young athletes' developing brains. All that being said, sports, the benefits absolutely far outweigh, right, the potential costs. They do. This is all worst case scenario. I'm not trying to get in everybody's head and make them freaked out. Sports are a collective good by far. I wouldn't hold your kids out of sports because of the concussion risk. However, I will say as a parent, my kids are not going to play football, more than likely. So there's that. All right. Hope everybody has a good weekend, a good week. We just got out of a hurricane here in Florida. We got very lucky and fortunate up this way. Some people down in Fort Myers, Naples, Sarasota, even up into Lakeland and Orlando and Kissimmee didn't fare as well. So if you're somebody who prays, keep them in your prayers, and we'll see you next time.